So hey everybody, welcome to another episode of the Universe Within podcast. Today's going to be another solo episode, and I'm going to be addressing a fairly common question that comes up here, which is what is the process that the healers, the doctors go through in order to learn the work that they're actually doing. How do they become a doctor? How do they become a curandero? And that's through a process, mainly, there's different ways, but mainly through a process of what's called doing a dieta or dieting. So that's going to be today's episode. I hope you enjoy it, and I will see you at the end. So today's question, what is the process of dieting or doing a dieta? As you maybe can see from behind me, I'm sitting here in the upper Amazonian basin, the Amazon jungle in the Peruvian side. And this area is very rich in a very old and intricate tradition of healing, and predominantly healing with plants. And like many places in the world, there's a very old history of holistic healing, of healing through different modalities that really look at the human organism as a whole. And this idea that when something is out of balance, there's dis-ease. When something is not at ease, there's a dis-ease. And so the idea is, how do we bring the human organism back into a state of ease, back into a state of harmony, of wholeness. And that's really the concept behind any type of holistic medicine. And all throughout the world, one can find many different types of holistic medicines. Here in the Amazonian jungle, again, there's a very long tradition of especially working with plants, and plants as medicine. And there's different names for that: vegetalismo, curanderismo, and there's many different types of doctors here in the jungle. As I mentioned in the first episode, there are people, for example, a vegetalista, someone who works with plants, and a way to think of that is almost like an herbalist, someone who would prescribe certain plants for certain conditions. There are curanderos, one who has the ability to heal or to cure, médicos, doctors. And then within those, there's many different classes depending on how the person works. For example, where I am right now at the Temple of the Way of the Light, one of the main curanderos who we work with are what are called ayahuasqueros, or in the Shipibo language, onaya. They're people who work with uni, which is the Shipibo word for ayahuasca. So an ayahuasquero would be a doctor, a curandero, who predominantly works with ayahuasca. They're tabaqueros, people who predominantly work with tobacco. They're sanangueros, people who work with chiricsanango, or one of the other plants in the sanango family. There's huachumeros, people who work with huachuma or San Pedro. And there's even other classes of doctors, people like a huesero, a bone doctor, someone who works with their hands and resets bones or manipulates the body through hands-on touch. Pusangueros, people who work with pusango, which is a type of perfume. So there's many classes of doctors, and often the way that one would learn could simply be through an apprenticeship program, learning with their teacher, learning with their maestro. In some parts of southern Colombia and the Amazon, that's often how they work, is just apprenticing, just going to ceremony, sitting with the person who's working, and just through that hands-on process, day in and day out, one eventually learns to do this work. Where we are here, there's a very specific way of learning, and that's called doing a dieta. And a dieta is just really what it sounds like. It means to diet. And because in this tradition they work so often with plants, the dieta is a way of learning directly, experientially through the plants. And what that process usually involves is the aspirant, the student, goes into an extended period of isolation. So they're isolated away from their friends, their family, perhaps their community, and the only communication they would have would be with their teacher, the person who's holding that space, who's giving them their diet. And then through a prolonged time of isolation, there's also added to that a prolonged time of deprivation. So one, there's the depriving of one's social circumstances, really not being able to talk, not having access to books or phones or really anything. And then really beginning to deprive oneself on the physical level through a process of either complete abstinence of food or a very strong reduction of food. In general, the longer the dieta is, one would need some food in order to sustain that. The shorter the dieta, it may be a process of complete fasting from food. And through that process of deprivation, of isolation, of depriving the body of food, one becomes physically very weak, but then internally one becomes very open. And probably many people have experienced that. If you've ever been really sick or you've had the flu, the body, there's a natural process where the body begins to abstain from food. And through that process, it begins to heal from within. It uses those resources to heal itself. And this is also a process that's really found all over the world, not just here in the Amazon, but in North America, things like vision quests, also prolonged periods of fasting, throughout the world, going into a cave or going off into the woods or a retreat and doing that isolation and fasting. You find it in Christianity, you find it in Islam, you find it in Zoroastrianism and Buddhism, and in almost every religion or spiritual tradition, you find these same practices. And again, the idea is that by taking time outside of our normal lives, our normal reality, and beginning to go inward, this tremendous process begins to unfold. And it's really a process of self-knowledge. Because when we don't have the ability to distract ourselves with any number of stimuli, in a sense, we're forced to go inside. There's nothing to do on this physical level. And so the only thing we're left to be able to do is to observe, in a sense, to be in the present. And with that, obviously not only the present, because we're with ourselves, we're with our minds, and the nature of the mind is most often this oscillating state between the past and the future. And if anyone who's practiced meditation, that becomes very clear. Our minds are this oscillating force, remembering stories of the past, projecting what I have to do next, these stories of the future. And through that period of isolation, we're kind of forced to see that oscillating nature of the mind. and eventually to come to more of a state of presence, of harmony. And in that state, there's an expanded awareness, there's an openness, there's a sensitivity. Also through that process of depriving the body of food, the body, the human organism becomes very open, very sensitive. And so on the initial level of dieting, there can be a process of really healing the physical body, again, the human organism. Sometimes it's said there's two types of diets. There's a healing diet and a learning diet. Really, they're essentially the same thing, but one may come to a dieta for one of those two reasons. One may have a very acute illness, and so plants are prescribed for that acute illness. And again, through that period of isolation, fasting, deprivation, and the ingesting of specific plants that are good for that condition, the body has a tremendous ability to heal. Now, with that, not only are the plants going to be working on a physical level, but psychologically, we also begin to look at the nature of the human mind. And in a sense, not only does the body have a chance to begin to recuperate and heal, but so does the mind. And sometimes we're able to very specifically even perhaps see what was my mental state, what is the nature of my thoughts in relationship to this disease. Was I having certain beliefs or patterns? Was I angry about something? Was I jealous about something? Have I been holding on a resentment towards a person or towards myself? And often these things come up, and through that process, there's also a working through of these aspects of our mind that potentially could be leading to the disease or helping to keep it manifest. So one of the reasons someone may come to a diet is specifically for physical, for mental, for emotional healing, and specific plants are prescribed for that. Then there's also the idea of doing a dieta to actually learn how to become a doctor or a curandero. And for many doctors, actually their journey starts with doing a dieta for a physical ailment. One of the curanderos we work with here, her name is Lila. I'm hoping to actually bring her on a podcast soon. That was actually her journey. Her journey started because she had a physical ailment. I think she fell maybe out of a tree, and she injured her body very badly. She wasn't able to walk. I think she went through the more allopathic treatment, and in the end it didn't work, and the doctors told her, look, there's really nothing more we can do for you. Interestingly, her mother was a curandera, and so eventually she went to her mother and she said, hey mother, can you heal me? Because when Leela was younger, she actually didn't so much believe in this kind of different way of healing through plants, through curanderismo. So she went to her mother and asked, can you heal me? And her mother said, yes, potentially, but you have to diet. That's the only way. And so Leela accepted, and she went through this very long period of dieting, initially to heal herself of a physical condition. And through that process, it worked. She was able to heal herself. Also through that process, she began to see the actual power of that process and the power of plants as a healing modality. And since she was able to heal herself, and this other system wasn't able to heal her, she actually began to gain faith in the system, to actually see it on an experiential level that, hey, this works. And so then it was through that process of dieting for her own healing that she was then, that kind of spark of curiosity arose of, hey, what is this? I'm interested in this. And then through more diets, she eventually became a curandera, or a doctor herself. So the process that one comes through, it could be, again, through a physical ailment where I'm sick, I have a problem, maybe I've tried a bunch of other things, and now I try this, and maybe it works. And then through that, that's kind of the gateway or the door to furthering oneself down this path. Some people may just feel an innate calling to learn to do this work. It's often said, kind of in this shamanic way of viewing things, that the path of the shaman is one of suffering. And that's a very common path. Many people reach a point in their lives where they realize, they're very conscious that they are suffering. That was essentially the main teaching of the Buddha, is that suffering is innate to the human being. And essentially it rises from this state of not following the middle path, not being in harmony. That the nature of our minds, again, is this state of either being in the past or the future. And so through this way of finding the middle way, finding the balance, understanding that I am suffering, and then looking for a way out of suffering. So that can be a really common path. Someone is just really suffering. They're depressed. They're anxious. They feel like they don't have a place in the world. They feel like something is off. They don't understand why they're alive. What is my path? Why are humans here? And these are questions we all have. But for some people, at some point, they can reach this threshold where it seemingly becomes too much. I think that was actually the story of Eckhart Tolle. Is he reached a point where he wanted to die. He was suicidal. He no longer had that spark of life because that depressive tendency, that suffering, was too great. And according to the story I remember, he said he went to bed one night and he didn't want to live. And in that final letting go, this question arose where he said to himself, I can no longer live with myself. But much like a kind of a Zen koan, that sparked something in him. He had this realization of, I can't live with myself. So who is saying that? Or are there two of me? Who is the I and who is the self that I can't live with? Are there two of me? Or are there one? And that really shifted something in him where, according to him, while he was sleeping, that really opened essentially a portal where he was kind of transported into this space, and this voice was just saying, resist nothing. And through that process, a metaphorical death, he was able to let go and in essence, to wake up. And that's a really common archetype with this work, is again, the suffering gets so great that there's this idea that we can no longer live with ourselves, and that forces us in a way onto a journey of self-knowledge, which is essentially what this work is. It's a journey of self-knowledge. That's what even this word ayahuasca in Shipibo means. It's uni is the Shipibo word for ayahuasca, and it essentially means knowledge or wisdom. And it's not a knowledge that we can inherently read in a book or listen to a lecture. It's a knowledge that comes from the actual experience of going into ourselves with the aid of these plants. And these plants have been revered in many traditions all throughout the world. I think for various reasons, through persecution, through just loss of knowledge, a lot of these traditions have been forgotten, or they went into hiding. But there's still traces of them there. There's esoteric symbols. There's remnants of them. There's still traces of this all throughout the world. And I think as one really begins to go on that journey, one begins to see those traces, in essence, everywhere they look. So that's one of the other paths. of doing a dieta for actually wanting to learn how to do this work. And again, often it doesn't even come necessarily from a sense of, I want to become a curandero, I want to become a shaman. Even that is somehow potentially still lost in this egoic mind, this mind of duality. I think often the curanderos who, from my experience, are very good, they have a lot of integrity. It doesn't even necessarily come from a place of I want to do this. It just comes from this deep desire inside of this quest of knowledge, of a journeying into the self. And through that process, through that journeying, slowly one is reaching a state where one just naturally begins to share. I practice Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, and it's a very similar thing. One just has to go through the day-to-day activities, and eventually one starts improving. One starts getting different belts. And at a certain point, the teacher just turns to that person and says, hey, can you show this new person this move? And it's almost this de facto way of teaching that eventually in our own journey, we just reach a state where someone comes to us and asks for help, and we help. Not out of necessarily some altruistic desire to help, but simply because help was asked. And through that way, again, the path begins to open. So getting back to dieting. Here in the Amazon, again, there's many different ways that one can learn, but very specifically to this region and to many of the cultures who live in this region, this process of dieting is a very strong tradition. And so essentially one would first need to find a teacher, and that's really important. It's not that one can't do this work by oneself, but again, these plants are very strong, and also this process of dieting, archetypically, it very much is this process of death, rebirth, and one gets in a very, very sensitive state, and to really hold that state, to really understand how to hold that state, which medicines to give, the doses to give, the frequencies to give them, how to manage what's arising in the person who's going through the diet, how to really navigate and guide that space. It really takes someone who's very skilled, and that skill comes from having done the work themselves. So in all of these traditions, there's always a teacher, there's always a guide. One of the really fascinating things about these traditions is they aren't inherently traditions of talking. And it's not that there isn't communication. There's very often communication, questions, answers. But there's a very strong faith, a very strong trust in the plants themselves, that the plants, by ingesting these plants, they open us to a space where we ourselves are able to find the answers. We're able to find the answers within us, and we're able to find the answers from without by really observing. And this is another really powerful tool of the dieta, is again, we're forced in a sense to simply observe. And that's why these dietas were often done in a natural setting where one can really begin to look at the mosquito and to really observe that, to look at the tree, to see how the seed, it shoots out of the ground and it slowly becomes a plant and then a tree. And there's so much symbology in that. There's so much to be learned in that. Looking at the butterflies, looking at the insects, looking at the cycles of day and night and change, and all of these things. There's a tremendous power and a tremendous teaching in them. So again, first one would find a teacher. One would also have to, again, have some sort of calling, whether it's to heal in the physical realm, to learn. to really be able to endure that process, because it's a very difficult process. For most of us, even going without checking our phone once a day can be very, very jarring now to some degree. There's almost that obsessive compulsion of needing to check, to be tuned in, to be plugged in. So imagine going a day without that. Imagine going a week without that. Imagine going a month without that. 3 months, 6 months, maybe a year, where it's really just you. I mean, there's literally nothing to do. And that's a very challenging process. And again, unless one really has a calling to do that, at some point, usually quite early on, someone is going to say, that's enough. This is not for me. I need something else. So that calling is super important. Having the calling, the intention, and then having the structure there, the environment, the architecture. That's an ode to one of our teachers here, whose name is Richard, who I also hope to get on the podcast soon. But those 3 things are very important: the intention, the architecture, the environment. So one has the intention, one has to find the teacher, and then there's this process of beginning to diet a plant. Usually the plant would be chosen by the teacher. In the Shipibo tradition, sometimes they would start by dieting smaller plants. These plants are often seen as really beginning to open one's sensitivities, so that one really begins to become more attuned to what's going on, attuned to one's senses, to really begin to refine one's senses, to begin to open the heart, to begin to observe the nature of the mind, to really begin to open the organism, the human organism. Sometimes also these first few diets can also be a very strong process of releasing, of purging, of literal purging out the sicknesses, the things that are inside of us, but also beginning to cleanse and purge the mind, to really begin to open the organism. And again, I use this analogy in the first podcast. It's kind of like cleaning a house. In order to clean the house, first we have to get rid of the heavy dirt. We have to clean that out in order to be able to reach a more and more refined state. So sometimes in those first few diets, it can be a process of a lot of purging, especially if one begins to work with stronger plants that do induce a purge. That can be a very common theme. For the Shipibo, after potentially doing a number of diets with smaller plants, they would begin to move towards trees. Because trees are archetypically, they're seen kind of this saying of as above, so below, or as so below, as above. And if you look at the tree, it really represents that. There's this long trunk, and going into the ground, rooting into the ground, are these roots that really expand a great distance, and actually. The more that it's even looked at by more modern science, that essentially that's even potentially the brain of the tree. That's the communication network, that it's actually communicating. It's interconnected with the root systems of so many things going on around it. There's the mycelium network, and all of these things are interconnected, intertwined. So there's the trunk, and then the roots going into the ground, and then just as above, or just as below as above, there's then the branches that begin to move towards the light, to move towards the heavens. And they feed off of the light. They take that light, they photosynthesize it, and the leaves begin to bloom and to take in that light, and slowly, it's moving up towards the heavens, up towards the light. And so symbolically, the tree represents that archetype. And much like the growth of a tree, the tree also represents this idea of every tree started as a seedling. This tiny thing, almost like an atom, this speck, sometimes almost invisible to the eye. Depending on the seed, it may be visible, but very, very small. And slowly, through that struggle, through that drive to move upwards, to evolve, to expand, it begins to turn into a seedling, into a shoot, and it breaks the earth, and it emerges from the darkness, and it comes into the light. And in that beginning, the tree is it's not even a tree at this point. It's a little shoot. It's very sensitive. It's very vulnerable. Someone could step on it, and it's done. An animal could come and eat it, and it's done. And it really needs to be cultivated. There's so many of those saplings shooting out, and they're all vying for this one space in the canopy where they can actually receive all of the nutrients that they need. And so not all of them are going to make it. But the ones who do, eventually they become stronger, they become more solid. Eventually it turns into a small tree. And as that evolution continues, eventually the tree becomes this magnificent specimen, this thing that's rooted into the ground, rooted firmly into the ground. And it's moving towards the sky. And in that way, the tree also archetypically represents this idea of strength, of stability. It provides us with shade, with shelter, with potentially fruits, with flowers. It provides us with wood to build a house, traditionally to make an arrow or a blowgun or a canoe. It gives and it gives and it gives. And so by dieting these trees, there's this real, again, archetype of strength, of power. And that's medicinally what many of these trees also do. Many of these trees, they're very strong purifiers of the blood. And in many of these traditions, they would view the blood as where we also hold a lot of illness. And so by cleansing the blood, by purifying it, which is a very alchemical analogy as well, we're able to transmute these base metals into gold, into something far more refined, far more pure. So, for example, for the Shipibo, again, there's this process of beginning to diet with smaller plants and then moving to trees. Some traditions would just start with trees right away. For example, a palero, someone who just works with trees, they inevitably would just start by dieting trees. So there's different ways of dieting, but again, it's going to depend on the teacher that you find, because again, each teacher is going to have their own way. Even amongst the Shipibo, there's many different ways of dieting. There's different plants that they would use. Some are drawn more to certain plants. Some are hesitant of certain plants. Someone else may find the plant that another one is hesitant about to be a really beautiful plant, and they may find another plant not so good. And so again, there's no formula or universal way of doing this. But what's fascinating is that all of these traditions have this process of dieting which is very similar. And I think because of that, it really also shows the power of that this is something that's practiced by many different peoples all throughout this jungle, really alluding towards the same thing through this process of fasting, isolation, and ingesting a plant. So, one would diet a plant. That plant can simply be taken by itself. It's almost always ingested in liquid form. That's the strongest way of working with any plant, is to actually ingest the essence of that plant. So for some plants, it may be a water-based decoction of it, but essentially making like a tea, taking the bark, boiling it in water, drinking that. There are some where it's macerated in alcohol, and that's taken. But most commonly in water. It's either left to soak in that water, it's cooked down in that water, and then that's ingested. It could just be taken by itself. That's a common way of taking it. Or it could be taken with one of these plants that I talked about in the first episode, which are called master plants. So, for example, the plant that's being dieted could also be taken with, for example, ayahuasca. So one could be dieting for whatever amount of time, and one may take ayahuasca to open the diet. So essentially, by taking ayahuasca, one is opening oneself to that diet. And then one begins to drink the plant at various intervals throughout the diet. One may take ayahuasca again every few days, once a week, once in the middle of the diet, and potentially also at the end of the diet to close the diet. One would drink again. That's one way. Another really common way is taking it with tobacco. And again, if you're not familiar with this work, that may sound really crazy. Why would someone take tobacco? But very soon I'm going to do an entire episode about tobacco, and I'm actually going to bring in a colleague of mine who also works with tobacco, and we'll do that together. But essentially, tobacco is also considered one of the master plants. And as I said in the beginning, there are tabaqueros, people who just work with tobacco as a healing modality. Often when we think of tobacco, what we're thinking of is smoking. And smoking is one way of working with tobacco, but it's probably the most recent, and it's the way that probably has the least effect. Which is why people can kind of smoke all day and not necessarily feel so much. There is some effect, but it's not the strongest. The strongest way of working with tobacco, like any plant, again, is making a liquid preparation of it and ingesting that. And please don't go and do that on your own, because like any of these plants, it is very, very strong. Toxic. All of these plants, they're medicine and they're toxic. That's essentially what makes them medicine. As Paracelsus said, the difference between medicine and poison is simply the dose. And this is true for any medicine. So with any medicine, it's very important, vitally important, to always work with someone who knows what they're doing. But essentially, one, much in the same way one could work with ayahuasca, one would ingest tobacco to open the process, and then begin to drink the plant, and then drink tobacco to close the process as well. Often, and you see this in many traditions, the plant itself is actually mixed into the juice of the tobacco juice, because tobacco is kind of seen as like the great regulator. It's also archetypically seen as, in many traditions, as the first plant, as kind of this archetypical grandfather spirit. And so many traditions would say the spirits, the essences of the plants, like the spirit of tobacco. They would say they feed off of the tobacco. The tobacco is essentially the food of the plants. And so by mixing the juice of the plant with the juice of tobacco and ingesting that, the plant is really able to penetrate the human organism. Also, tobacco has very particular qualities in and of itself. One of those is it's a very, very strong purgative. So through that process of ingesting the plant with tobacco, there's a very strong purgative process that's induced. And that's very much the beginning of this cleansing process of really beginning to cleanse the body on a physical level. And then also, if you're familiar, for example, like with traditional Chinese medicine, it's beginning to open the body on a more energetic level, beginning to open what could be called the meridians, or, really just looking at it as opening the sensitivity of the body. And again, cleansing the body, cleansing the intestines, which is also where a lot of sickness arises from. There's all sorts of new studies now about just the amazing neural network in the intestines, in the gut. That's even where these phrases we have come from, like, trust in your gut. I have this gut feeling, this gut instinct. So there's a lot going on there. So cleaning the intestines, cleaning the blood. And then after this prolonged period of cleaning, the body is very open, very sensitive. Then one has the ability to experientially learn from the plant itself. In more of this kind of traditional language, it would be said that the aspirant is learning from the spirit of the plant. That may sound kind of crazy to a lot of people, but I think just a really easy way of looking at it is, again, everything in this universe that we know of is unique. Every 2 blades of grass are unique. Every 2 human beings are unique. Every 2 plants are unique. Every 2 things are unique. So every plant has a unique spirit. It has a unique quality. It has unique properties that are specifically unique to itself. And we know this from all medicine. There's not one pharmaceutical medicine that treats everything. There's all sorts of pharmaceutical medicines, and they all have their own spirit. They all have their own properties, their own abilities to heal. So that's a really kind of reductionist way of looking at it. What many people would describe when they begin to work with and ingest these plants is that they're essentially put in touch with something else, whether that's, people may describe it as their higher self, their soul, their consciousness. Some people would use the word God or spirits. But essentially, something is opened where there's this communication, there's this dialogue, and these teachings come through. And also, as I mentioned in the very first podcast, often these medicines, these plants, are inducing this dreamlike state. Much like that story I mentioned of Eckhart Tolle, I think it's no coincidence that process happened to him in his dream space while he was sleeping. And also, from what I understood, not in the deep sleep, but almost in that state when we're awake and we're falling asleep. That kind of space where, again, we have one foot a bit in both worlds. And that's essentially what these plants are inducing. They're inducing that lucid state where we have access to these various levels of consciousness. And again, that's not some weird new agey thing. Just like the sleep analogy, we have access a bit to this state of consciousness that we're in, and we have access to that state of consciousness that we're going into as we begin to sleep, which again is a highly, highly altered state of consciousness. So, tobacco is also one of the plants that can be used. And again, other plants can be used as well. Those two are, from my experience and from many of the traditions I've worked with, those are the most common ones that are used in the dieting experience. So, with the dieting itself, it could last anywhere from really 1 week to 1 year. In antiquity, they often spoke of diets maybe even going longer times, but I've never heard of anyone really doing a continuous diet for any longer than that. And one can do many different diets. So one could diet one plant a number of different times. One could diet a number of different plants. And essentially, in the language that's used here, by doing these diets, we're essentially building these allies or building these plant spirit companions in a way. That essentially when I do that diet, somehow I embody the essence of that plant, of that medicine. And so who I am is essentially changed. I've gone through that experience of that journey with that plant, and the essence of that plant is then with me. So for some people, the journey could be learning the physical properties of that plant. What is it good for treating? How can I use that plant to also treat other people? And for some plants, it could be that, and or it could be a process of really going again inside the self and learning about the self. And through that process of reflection, through that process of journeying into the self, I'm changed. And I learn about myself via the medium of that plant. And then through that state of being changed, of having awareness, I'm able to go out and then to affect that change, to live in that state, to take what I've learned from that experience and then to bring it out into this reality, into my day-to-day life. As I talked about also in the first episode, these different levels of curandero, and for the Shipibo, for example, this highest level, the Moraya, that's why they would say there are no more Moraya left, because essentially that path is too difficult, that there's nobody who really wants to go 6 years out into the jungle and do a diet anymore. And so, in essence, that level of the curandero, of the doctor, has been lost. So many people, again, would diet for varying lengths of time. In general, the shorter the diet, the more strict. So, for example, I could do a diet maybe of 1 week or 2 weeks, which isn't necessarily that long in a length of time, but it would be very strict. So complete isolation, not eating anything, and drinking every day a very strong plant brew of whatever plant dieting, potentially mixed with tobacco, for example. So that would be a very short, relatively, depends on what you think, 1 or 2 weeks, diet, but very strong. So no food and drinking every day and a very strong purging process. So kind of this idea of short but sweet. Not really sweet, but very strong. One could then begin to extend that. 2 weeks, 1 month, 3 months, 6 months. In general, if one was to extend it, one wouldn't be able to, for example, fully fast. So some food would have to be introduced. Maybe one fast for 1 week from both food and even potentially water, maybe a few days, a week with no water even, to really begin to weaken the body, to open it, and then food is introduced. And in general, this is where this idea of dieta food comes from, food that's specifically designed to aid in the process. And on a really basic level, the food is just very simple food, something like plantain, or maybe a little bit of fish once in a while, but a very particular type of fish. And again, the idea behind that is just to give the body enough nourishment so that it can continue to diet, but that very weakened and open state is maintained. And again, on the archetypical way of looking at it, it's very much like inducing that death-like state, that the body is approaching that death state. Because again, on the other side of that death state is rebirth, learning something new, opening to a new way of being. So that is all going to depend on who the teacher is, what the tradition is, how they work, how they've learned, and then really just following through that process. And some people may they may do one diet and then that's it. They may do a diet and then go off and live their lives, and then again they feel that calling and they come back to it at a later time. And some people just go into a really intensive process of just dieting for months on end, maybe even a year, 2 years, where they're just really involved continuously in that state of dieting. They may take breaks, for a few days in between, or take a few weeks off to recover one's energy and then go back into it. But essentially, that's the process. that's the process of doing a dieta, which is the way that here in the upper Amazonian basin that many curanderos, doctors, learn to do their craft. So essentially, by that process of isolation, fasting, ingesting plants, one begins to clean oneself, clear, open oneself, heighten one's sensitivities, and begin to experientially learn from these plants, which have this, tremendous ability to really teach, to open ourselves up so that we begin to learn about ourselves via the medium of this process of dieting. And really through the grace of these plants, which have been considered teachers for a long time, for countless generations. And so there's a real tradition and a real appreciation. Often if you ask, for example, the Shipibo, they have this real gratitude and reverence for their ancestors. And if you ask them why, they would say, because our ancestors taught us. And if you ask, well, what did they teach you? They would say, they taught us to use the plants. And I think that's really beautiful because, again, it's not a knowledge that's coming from a book. It's not a teaching per se that's necessarily passed down. It's a way of learning, and it's a way that each and every person, if they have that desire, can begin to learn. And that's where that idea of uni, for example, of wisdom, of knowledge, is so valuable because, again, it's a knowledge that comes from an experience. It's a knowledge that comes through this archetypical hero's journey of really entering the self, going into this inward journey of the self, and having all of these things come up, the doubts, the fears, the beliefs, the traumas, all of the things that are holding us back, that are keeping us in this state of dis-ease. And through that process, we begin to bring balance, we begin to bring harmony, and we begin to take this knowledge that these plants have opened us to, and then if we feel called, we can potentially begin to share that. And so we'll probably stop there. And also, again, as I alluded to a little bit, from my experience, the really good curanderos would often, very rarely, if ever, actually call themselves a curandero. At best, they may say they're a guide, or that essentially what they're doing is they're just trusting. They're trusting in the plants. They're trusting in what the plants give them access to. Many will just use this word God, that they have a trust, they have a faith in God, which these plants give them access to. So it's not even they themselves, the curandero, doing the work. It's them really holding this space, creating this space through the grace, through the blessings of their teachers, through the plants, that they've seen experientially that this can work. And by doing that, they're able to give that, to offer that to other people, to experience that themselves. And it's a much more powerful realization when we go inside and we find those answers ourselves than if we're taught them by someone or if we read them somewhere in a book. It's a real sense of knowing that this is true. It's truth because I've experienced it, I've lived it. And that's the most powerful type of knowledge. And that's really the knowledge we can get from anything, simply by observing nature, by taking time to be with ourselves, by even just taking a few minutes to meditate, to really look around and to really experience things and to begin to see and to observe. And that's where this real power of knowledge comes from, of truth, of wisdom. And the dieta is a really powerful way to amplify that and to really go inside and to find those things. And this world of the plants through these, this amazing tradition and these amazing lineages that have continued to survive, there's this very powerful tradition and this way of working through plants, through the ingesting of these various plants that have, again, the ability to heal us on all of these different levels, to heal us physically, to heal the mind, to heal the ways in which we think, to heal the emotions. And for many people, in a really broad sense, this spiritual healing, this sense of well-being, this sense of connection, this sense of awe, this sense of humility, this sense of grace, this sense of an appreciation for being alive, at really seeing the awe of humans, of plants, of nature, of the world, of the universe. And in that state, people who really delve into this work and really go inside can slowly become a vehicle to then be able to share that through their own work, through their own sacrifice. And again, the path of the curandero, of the shaman, it's a very difficult path. It takes years and years of that self-introspection, of dieting, of fasting, of isolation, of drinking many different plants many times, and through this process, this slow process of polishing the stone, reaching a state where they're able to share. And that state also is never permanent. It's constantly evolving, constantly changing, constantly growing. And the really good curanderos, they're constantly doing their own work. Not necessarily every day, all the time, but they're taking specific times to continue to grow and to continue to do their own work so that they continue to share better. So I'll leave it with that. Thank you very much for watching. I hope you enjoyed it, and I will see you on the next episode. So thank you all so much for tuning in. I hope you enjoyed that episode on dieting. Again, if you have any questions, leave them in the comment section. Again, that will really help me to know what you're interested in, what kind of questions that either I can address, or if I'm not able to address them, that I can hopefully bring on someone who's able to speak to that, and hopefully from a place even better than I can do that. So leave comments. And again, if you're able to leave a rating, a starred rating, and a review, just taking 5 minutes to do that, that would be a really big help to get this podcast out there. And then there's also a link to a Patreon account and a direct donation account, where if you're able to give anything at all, that would be really, really appreciated. Many of us doing this work, we've been out of work for 4 or 5 months now. It's still probably going to be another 4 or 5 months, just because everything in Peru is shut down because of the pandemic. So if you're able to support it all financially, it would be really, really amazing, and I'd be super grateful for that. So thank you all so much, and I think that's it, and I will see you on the next episode. Thank you, guys.
Tung